This is a special report on Watergate from the Bay Area Institute. My name is Marty Gellen. I have here with me in the studio Peter Scott, who's author of a book called The War Conspiracy, and has done extensive research into intelligence operations of the U.S. government. Franz Schurmann, who's from the Bay Area Institute and who has just completed a book on American foreign policy, and Fran Watkins, who is from KPFA and who is going to moderate the rest of this program. We're going to talk about Watergate and try not so much to get into this whole spaghetti netting of connections and people who know people and people who have been connected to other people in the Justice Department and the Treasury and the Committee to Re-elect the President, but try to deal overall with the kind of crisis that has emerged within the United States government due to this whole Watergate scandal.
I think that's a good introduction, Marty, because it seems to me that there's sort of two kinds of analysis going on about the Watergate thing. One form of analysis is who did it, who are these people, and who do they know, as you mentioned. And I think the more neglected and probably the more important aspect of this is who is in power in Washington and what significant power shifts have we seen as a result of Watergate, possibly that led up to Watergate or that may relate to Watergate in some kind of way.
I'd love to begin by picking up on the question whether the Watergate is creating a crisis or is in response to a crisis. And I think that one way of establishing perspective on what's happening and who are the power groups is I'd like to at least put forward the hypothesis that Watergate is more in response to a deeper crisis than itself the single cause that has created all the commotion in the papers these days. And I think that a very real crisis has been created for the U.S. dollar and for the U.S. economy by the kind of turnaround that's symbolized by de-escalation in Indochina, although it's by no means complete, that de-escalation. Because for decades, really, since World War II, America has been posited on the idea of an expanding economy, and a bigger and bigger share of that was the government pie, and there was always enough pie for everybody. When Nixon came into power, he came into power supported by and with his cadres recruited from people who were not really the establishment of this country, but were marginal to the establishment, and in some cases I would call them marginal people. And as long as we had this expanding economy, it was in the interests of those really in power in this country to work with these people. The marginal people recruited for a bigger defense budget. They campaigned for more aggressive U.S. involvement overseas and so on. They had a very direct stake in this because in expanding the economy, they were carving out a little share for themselves, but they were also supporting the sort of defense economy climate, which probably profited the people at the center even more than these marginal people.
Let me interrupt you for just a minute and see if we can nail down who some of these marginal people are. I assume that you're referring to people like Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, who had not been directly involved in politics before they came into power via the Nixon administration.
Yes, exactly. They're doubly marginal because they're not really at the center of the U.S. political system as it's normally envisioned. And one of the big complaints that's coming from Congress, and the question, you hear it in the questions of the Select Committee, is who in the Committee to Re-elect the President really knew anything about electoral politics. At best, they were media people. They were not people who had ever represented and who were at the heart of the political process in that sense. And then they were also marginal in sense of the kind of areas they came from, the kind of people they represented. And the Committee to Re-elect the President, I think, frightened a lot of the people at the center because here was a committee with an enormous budget. Nobody knows how big, estimated to be maybe $40 or $50 million, with maybe $10 or $20 million left over after the election. And these people who in many ways didn't represent anybody hoped to be able to perpetuate themselves because of their control over this enormous, just fantastic electoral kitty.
Now, we've defined the marginal people. Could we talk a little bit about who you would define as the principal people as opposed to the marginal people?
Well, I think that I think there'll probably be general agreement, that certainly people like Haldeman and Ehrlichman, perhaps not Mitchell, are marginal in the sense that, as Peter said, we're not in the center of the American political system as is normally understood. Now, in a way, the question you're asking, Fran, is one that should be asked after a long, searching consideration, because it's sort of tries to answer the final question of who does wield the power and who has the power, wealth, and prestige that counts, in this country. And perhaps it might be better if we start off with perhaps on a somewhat more factual and empirical basis and review some of the known but not very prominent facts. And one that I'd like to just call listeners' attention to is what happened immediately after the election last year. And that is, to everyone's surprise, Nixon called for the resignation of all top officials in the administration. And something like 2,000 resignations were requested. This was considered the most extraordinary thing. And it is normal that ambassadors routinely resign and that cabinet officials routinely resign and so on, but it's not normal that such a precipitate action be taken, which, as most people in Washington observed at the time, seemed to be almost tantamount to a purge, or had the threat of a purge in it. Now, this gets me to the point that Peter made in response to your first question, that is Watergate the crisis that produced all these things, or was it a response to a crisis? I certainly agree with him that it was a response to a crisis. And I think the action that Nixon took last November, and just after the election, in calling for these resignations, suddenly seemed to open up all sorts of power positions. The command posts of power were, at least in theory, going to be vacant. Now, you don't do that normally. I mean, in normal politics, either you replace people one by one, you accommodate to the interests, you argue it out. Appointing someone is not just giving someone a salary or even a certain amount of power. I mean, it brings one interest group comes in, another interest group comes out. So clearly there was something extraordinary about that action. And what happened as a result of that action is very complicated and even more extraordinary. Now, the crisis, I think, is there. I think, and everyone knows it, and everyone has sensed it. I mean, it has been Vietnam. It has been the monetary situation. It has been the thing, the energy crisis and the jugular vein in the Middle East and all sorts of other things. I mean, that crisis is sensed by virtually everyone in this country. So it's. I think at this point one can say that clearly, that remarkable call for 2,000 resignations or so right after the election was indicative of the fact that this new administration, having just won one of the biggest landslide victories in the history of the United States, in which one normally would think that it could confidently proceed to wisely or not so wisely, but at least in confidence guide the destiny of the United States, that it was in a state of panic, having secured enormous victories in the state of panic, and starts the beginnings of a purge.
Can I just add to that? I think another comparable development was the posture that Nixon adopted towards Congress and the virtual sort of declaration of war on Congress, which became partly worse because of Watergate, but was aggravated by other factors as well. So if I were answering your question, I would break it down into three parts and say that establishment people felt threatened, first of all, in Congress, and that what you might call the bipartisan backbone, particularly of the Senate, has now become very jealous of the Senate's privileges and is responding, obviously, to Nixon. There were established institutional people within the bureaucracy, perhaps most visibly in both the FBI and the CIA, where we know that many of the people in the FBI objected to the putting in of L. Patrick Gray by Nixon, and I think quite obviously contributed to the leaks of information which led to Gray's downfall. Similar thing in the CIA, where putting in Schlesinger from the outside was a new thing for the agency. No one knows all the facts, but it seems like Helms didn't want to leave the post of head of the CIA. He was moved out, and a Nixon man was put in. And I suspect that people in the agency are now anti-Nixon for that reason. And finally, perhaps the biggest question, and I don't presume to answer it properly here, but the kind of economic interests who think 20 years ahead and are really interested in the sort of a planned, orderly development of the U.S. economy versus all these quick buck operators who get some kind of fantastic contract in Vietnam this year, even if it's going to ruin the U.S. economy in the process. That's what I'd call the marginal economic interests who are looting the public treasury, and a lot of what's happened in Vietnam is almost a kind of looting, I think, as opposed to the people who are also used to enriching themselves at the expense of the taxpayer through government, but do it in a long term. They're really interested in seeing the country stable and people reasonably happy and so on. And people call that Wall Street, if you want a word, but I don't think that's very helpful.
Do you think that the current crisis with the dollar and the current sort of contraction of American economic power abroad has sort of intensified the differences between these two sorts of groups, the center group and then the more kind of marginal people, not just within the government, but in terms of the business connections that you spoke of?
Very definitely, and I think this goes back really to '68. We have to remember a very analogous crisis when Johnson and the military wanted to put 206,000 more men into Vietnam, and this was leaked to the New York Times, and all in the context of a radical weakening of the U.S. dollar and new figures about balance of payments crisis and so on. And we saw the Pentagon Papers make this quite clear, that in early 1968, a delegation of bankers came down from Wall Street and in effect told Johnson, you can't send 200,000 men to Vietnam because the country can't afford it. And the response of Johnson to that, it was painful for him and he was slow to do it, but in the end of March he announced that he would not run for re-election and he would not send the 200,000 men, and meanwhile he recalled Westmoreland and so on. This was clearly, I think, a crisis between the bankers at the center who had to worry about the economy as a whole and these marginal people who, for various reasons, bureaucratic, military, economic, whatever, wanted desperately to hang on in Vietnam.
Let's go back to the story. I'm hooked in the first chapter now, where the president gets a large majority in the election and fires everybody, and we're in a state of panic. Let's go back to that. Now, what's the next chapter?
Well, perhaps one can begin I would submit there are many chapters, a big book, but this section of the book begins with Nixon's electoral victory, this particular chapter. I mean, there are earlier chapters. If one looks at the shifts that occurred in December, and I think would probably go too far afield to deal with them, there's some remarkable personnel shifts, and it seemed to be evidence of struggles. And I'll just mention one, and that was a position of Kleindienst, that the talk, as reflected in the newspapers at the time, was that Kleindienst would not be confirmed as Attorney General, and that Nixon would nominate someone else. And Kleindienst himself was very unsure. He thought he would be nominated. But then Barry Goldwater paid a visit to Nixon and pleaded for his fellow Arizonian. And then sometime during the midst of this very intensive bombing, I believe it was early in January, that Nixon finally announced that Kleindienst would be nominated as Attorney General. At that time also, a number of surprising moves occurred. Secretary of Commerce Peter Peterson, who had negotiated all the big trade deals with the Russians, unexpectedly was ousted. And the business pages were full of this very ominous news that he seemed to be, from their point of view, a very good Secretary of Commerce. And, of course, the most startling thing of all, the ouster of Helms as director of the CIA, who was widely praised as a true professional and a man, with no political, unlike, I suppose, Alan Dulles or John McCone of ITT fame now. So there were a lot of lesser changes, too, that occurred. The appointment of William Clements as Deputy Secretary of Defense and arguments about that. Now, there's one thing that occurred around the Clements thing, which I'd like to ask Peter about, because we have been discussing some similar things. When the talk in December, exactly at this time, with this enormous amount of bombing going on, was going when there was talk about who should be Deputy Secretary of Defense. That's the same position that David Packard had held during the first Nixon, or during a part of the first Nixon administration. It was reported that Richardson favored a man named Moore, I believe his name was Jonathan Moore, who was reputed to be a dove in Vietnam and rather liberal and somewhat like Richardson in his views, and Richardson very much wanted to have him as Deputy Secretary of Defense. And the Washington Post item reported rather curiously that some of the sort of more conservative appearing people like Charles Colson, who was already out at that time practicing law in Washington, some others, were lining up with the liberals in support of Moore. Sort of the old right and the old left, or the old liberals, getting together to support a Dove candidate. And, of course, the man who was finally nominated was the representative of major oil interests in Texas, and exceedingly hard, a hawkish type person from what one can tell. I was going to ask Peter here that the phenomenon that appeared at that time, that seems to be reappearing again in the present Watergate hearings, of old conservatives or old reactionaries, let's say sort of FBI-oriented people, or McCord was described by a right-wing person to me whom we happen to know as a fine operative. But people like that zeroing in on Nixon, along with the old liberals, who are also now. I wonder whether you kind of...
Well, I think this is the end product of the whole Nixon strategy of being, keeping the power very tightly to himself and recruiting. Instead, what I think a traditional presidential strategy is to surround himself by representative people, perhaps overly representative. You've got to get somebody from the center, Midwest, and the Northeastern, all that sort of thing. But Nixon recruited, particularly in his White House staff, but generally he recruited also particularly and in the Justice Department from about three areas. One of them was the leftovers of the old, what used to be called the Arizona Mafia from the Goldwater campaign, Kleindienst, Rehnquist, yes, well, Kleindienst would be the biggest example now. And then, secondly, his law firm in New York, Mitchell, and the people that Mitchell recruited. And finally, and perhaps most prominent now, were the Haldeman people from J. Walter Thompson. That was Chapin and the people, most of the people that were in the White House were recruited by Haldeman. These people were so close and so tight that the result wasn't that it so much split the Republican Party, but it separated Nixon and his little gang from the Republican Party, and also obviously from the Democrats, so that we can see the phenomenon most clearly inside Congress, where the right and the left helped to stop the Gray nomination, perhaps the chief role being played by Senator Byrd, who's a right-wing Democrat, and hoping in so doing to strengthen his forces and the Strauss forces inside the Democratic Party. But what's interesting is we see the same thing outside of Congress. You might expect it in Congress because there it's a fight between Congress and the presidency. But we find the same thing really happening outside, I think, as well, that the Republican National Committee, for example, is obviously very unhappy about the role that is being taken in this last campaign by the committee to re-elect the president, and has a direct stake. It's a complicated role they have to play, but they have a very direct stake in trying to recapture primacy in the Republican Party for the Republican National Committee. And that's something, again, which unites the right-wingers and the left-wingers in the party. Then finally, you see, trying to look a bit into the future, what I wonder is, what will happen if, say, the price of gold goes up to $150 an ounce or something like that? Because at a moment like that, it seems to me quite possible. At a moment like that, I'm sure that the bankers and the center will come back to Nixon with an ultimatum, and I think Nixon has felt enough of that kind of pressure already to explain his statement on Tuesday of this week, which was essentially an attempt to try and reassure people backing the dollar and to discourage speculators by saying clearly, I will not resign. I think that was done directly with an eye to what's happening to gold in the international markets. I think we may move towards a crisis in this country where the bankers come to Nixon and say, we can't afford, the nation cannot afford to have you in office anymore. Now, in the case of Johnson in 1968, there was only 6 months to run in his candidacy. The case of Nixon, who I don't think will give up easily, but also I think is really visibly lacking in support. It's like that scene in 7 Days in May where they see a general rowing a boat, and they realize that the conspirators have not got very many personnel between them when the general has to row a boat. Well, I think we see the same thing in Washington when Nixon has to move his clean men like Schlesinger and Richardson around from post to post to post. It becomes rather comic, but it's a very clear indication when he fails to recruit Packard or any serious established personality for to be Secretary of Defense. It's a very clear sign that he is without allies at this point, and yet at the same time, he is the chief of state. It's a very, very paradoxical and I think dangerous situation.
I think it is. It obviously is dangerous. With an item that Marty pointed out to me in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and the first hints of a possible recession. We've had inflation for a long time, and unemployment has gone down somewhat, but still not satisfactory. But there's been this boom,
and bombing Cambodia will not
That's right.
solve any economic
now,
problems.
One difference, it seems to me, Peter, between 68 and now, is that in March 1968, that the issue was to have Johnson do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore he committed political suicide.
A good point, yes.
Whereas now the issue is to have the president do something.
We need a strong president.
We need a strong president, because doing nothing now means the whole thing just goes over the side and flows into the abyss.
I wonder if I could make an analogy. One is interested me more and more in the last year, between the way in which Indochina corrupted the politics of the Fourth Republic in France in the 1950s and became sort of the one stable thing in the Fourth Republic was the Indochina War. It just went on and on and on and couldn't be stopped. And there was so much corruption around it that it succeeded in corrupting not only officials in Indochina but officials in Paris and ultimately the assembly itself. And that same corruption surviving almost without break into the late 50s and 60s and now corrupting America as well, and American politics, so that although we go from Democrats to Republicans, the one sort of stable thing in American politics has been some kind of U.S. presence in Indochina, which is clearly unpopular, which is now even unpopular with Congress as well as with the people, and yet is something that the Nixon administration seems to be indelibly committed to, in particular these marginal people that he has brought around him. They don't like to be ideologically prominent. It's not easy to pin a label on people like Haldeman and Ehrlichman, but clearly it's people like them who have been it has been their power, certainly not Congress's power, which has been responsible for these sudden escalations like the one you talked about last December. And the reason that analogy concerns me so much is that really the only way out for France from the mess of first Indochina and then ultimately Algeria was a kind of conspiracy of the center, which dumped both the corrupted politicians of the Fourth Republic, or the worst of them, and also some of the ultras who were trying to push always for more and more commitments to Algeria, so that everyone felt that de Gaulle had betrayed them in that. But in a sense, it was a conspiracy to restore...
And tried to assassinate him 6 times.
Yes. It was not an easy thing at all. Well, I just wonder if we aren't moving into a kind of comparable period, a kind of degradation of leadership as we saw in France, so that somebody like Pinay in France is comparable to somebody like Agnew in power today. He's a vice president. He's not really a representative man, I think, certainly not representative of the powers in this country. I'm just very concerned that so far there has been no talk of violence of any kind or force in response to this situation. And as long as the country remains more or less on balance, as there's no real sudden threat to the economy or to the dollar, either monetary or economic, then I think we can solve this problem. But we know that there are all kinds of danger signals on both levels, both the actual fate of the dollar and also the fate of the economy, the threat of recession. Some people have compared 1973 to 1929, more and more corporate profits, but less and less faith in the economic future for this country.
Well, we've
increasing
talked about
scandal as well.
Yes.
That was one of the hallmarks of 1920.
We've talked about the need now, as far as the economy is concerned, and institutional investors and big business, for a strong president to do something. Now, how in the world can we come from the state that we're in now with a president who's powerless and totally paralyzed, and with a staff that's absolutely not functioning? Government is not going on as usual in Washington. Now we're at this point of crisis as far as the economy and our whole position with the rest of the world is concerned. So how do you get out of it?
I don't think there's any hope with President Nixon, because we have seen, I think it's just clear that when Nixon does something in the economic area, he does the wrong thing. I mean, phase 2, which looked like controls, was control of labor, control of wages, some kind of control of prices, the interest of maximizing profits. But we have this colossal balance of payments problem right now. And what moves most easily out of the country, what encourages the flight of capital out of this country, is to maximize profits. It's precisely profits that are mobile, and it's profits which have been flying out of this country. And that's an aspect of the whole economic crisis which no one seems to talk about, although I hear all kinds of people who are engaged in this kind of withdrawal of dollars from this country say, of course, controls will have to come. It can't go on like this. That's why I talk about a kind of looting of this country, which is very analogous to France in the 50s. You could even, I mean, this is perhaps exaggerating, but it's not totally incomparable to, say, China in the 1930s. It's kind of systematic degradation of politics at the center, which is allowed for such powerful private enrichment that it reinforces the power at the center, even though the society as a whole is steering into worse and worse trouble.
There's an enormous flight of capital out of this country is clear. I mean, people are talking about $100 billion in liquidity, of which 93% is owned by American multinational corporations, and the other 7% supposedly by Arabs, whatever Arab oil interests. And they seem to be the bad boys in this whole situation. But obviously, it's much more profitable and lucrative, and to transform dollars into turn dollars into mark and yen. Whatever happens, I mean, maybe Nixon will be a Hoover or a second-term Eisenhower, and in the face of all these challenges, not be able to do very much. But I don't think that this country has faced a general crisis such as it began to face in 1929. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But general crisis, a lot of problems have all come together, and major problems affecting the country as a whole. That this has not happened since 1929. But at the same time, leaving aside Watergate and leaving aside Nixon, and looking simply at the kind of institutional changes that occurred at the top level of government, there have been moves toward a presidential dictatorship. That the power of the presidency has been systematically built up to unbelievable proportions.
Of course, we must be fair and say this has been a cumulative process since 1950.
1949.
Well, actually, Franklin Roosevelt, remember.
All right, yes.
One thing that seems to characterize this crisis, though, is that Nixon himself seems to lack the ability to smoothly and harmoniously represent the interests of the American ruling class as a whole, represent their general interests. He always seems to be in a quandary to the extent that he is bending over backwards to help some of these marginal kinds of businesses and interests which you mentioned, Peter, or in some cases, specific corporations. It's the IT&T affair revealed. And to do it in such a way that damages his ability to represent the kind of general interests of the American business oligarchy. And one thing I was wondering if maybe we could just deal a bit with some of these kind of marginal or specific interests that Nixon bends over backwards to help, and in particular those which seem to have been somewhat implicated in the whole Watergate affair, and which I guess is really mainly Nixon's dealings with various people in Florida who have been associated with the mafia. You know something about this, Peter, do you not?
Let me go back and see if we began this whole discussion with the idea of the Watergate scandal being a response to a crisis. Mm-hmm. So as we talk about this, let's see if we can go back to the original question and say specifically how Watergate has been a response to this crisis, which is certainly worsened as a result of Watergate.
Well, what I've been trying to suggest is that there are people in Congress, in the bureaucracy, and in, shall we say, Wall Street, in the sort of economic establishment, who are very interested in weakening the power of the president this time, and particularly in separating the president from certain kinds of people. And ironically, I think these have proven now to be the people that are hardest to separate the president from. And Bibi Raboso is an example. Obviously, there have been a lot of editorials that have, from particularly East Coast papers, establishment papers, have suggested that it's not appropriate for the president to spend nearly all of his free time with a man who is accused of making a fortune out of black marketing in World War II, is visibly being involved in business deals with convicted with criminals, including one man who in 1964 was called one of the top syndicate figures in the United States, whose Bibi Raboso repeatedly does direct business dealings with. There's a dark side to Richard Nixon. I'm not saying it's the only side to him, but Nixon's own personal investments have been in Miami real estate and have been involved. Raboso has usually been a principal in this, and I think it's no accident at all that this little real estate company called Amaritas, which was suspected at the beginning as being a front for the Watergate operation, it was operated by Eugenio Martinez, who was one of the people actually arrested inside the Watergate. And of course Nixon's connections with the Cuban exiles is a whole second story, but I'm just talking about his personal business deals. Eugenio Martinez is supposed to have formerly been a vice president of Keys Realty, which is, among other things, the firm which handled a succession of very shady business operations in land deals, some of which are now owned, some of that land now owned by Raboso and Nixon seems to have delayed registration of his lots precisely because he knew of the sort of shady background of this. And one could go on for hours about Keys Realty, but say only that in the Kefauver hearings back in 1950, this company was named, along with its lawyers, as being principals in providing the payoffs to the corrupt sheriff of Dade County, that's to say Miami, Florida, which explained why Miami was such a center for gambling and other criminal activities in that time.
I think we have to go back, though, and establish specific incidents, if we can. Now, why was the president or the committee to re-elect the president, certainly we know, involved in all this business of political espionage and spying on Democrats and all of the other hanky-panky
building up a
that
system
went along.
of illicit
Now,
power. Let's take the IT&T example.
Okay.
One of the things that turned out, well, I'm sorry to get back into the name spaghetti, but it really is incredible, isn't it, that Dean had E. Howard Hunt go out and speak to Dita Beard at a time when there was all the controversy about the Dita Beard memorandum in the IT&T case. And apparently they did this because of the fact that the Dita Beard memorandum had been given to the FBI on the explicit instructions that it was not to go any further, and that L. Patrick Gray had a hand. It was the man who had received the memorandum and had said, yes, it won't go any further. And the next thing we know, E. Howard Hunt is going out to speak to Dita Beard about it before it was common knowledge. All those deals, and we obviously don't have time to list the deals, but in sort of these trade-offs where the government eases through something for any kind of private interest, the response of which is a private payment to private funds to re-elect the president. You have a kind of a self-maintaining power system there, which is independent from and alien to the whole sort of anticipated congressional bureaucratic relationships.
I think the campaign chest and the campaign donations is a much more obvious thing and easier to understand. Let's go back to the Watergate incident itself. Do we have any basis here for answering the question of why was the Democratic National Committee headquarters broken into in the first place?
I think
and why was it so badly bungled? And then can we go from there?
Well, I'll let somebody else answer the question. I just want to make a clarification. When I say we have a Watergate crisis in response to another crisis, I don't regard the breaking into the Watergate as the thing that caused the Watergate crisis. I think if we'd had a different economic and political situation in the first part of this year, you would never again have heard about the Watergate break-in. We have to distinguish between the break-in, which is not unprecedented in this country, from the way in which the nation has responded to that break-in, which is, I think, unprecedented.
Well, I think we have to go back and say that if McCord had never written his letter to Judge Sirica, that we never would have heard any more about the Watergate thing. But I think we're
if the L. Patrick Gray nomination had gone through Congress, we would never have heard it.
Yes, that's true. I'm perfectly prepared to accept that part of the thesis. The place I think where it gets muddy is why did McCord write his letter to Judge Sirica? How did it happen that these people were caught? And because after all, the thing was very badly bungled with the tape on the doors. If these people are actually very fine operatives, as you quoted earlier, Franz, how did this kind of thing happen?
Mr. Ulasevich said if he was going to send a wireman in there, he wouldn't send him in with an army. I think that's very true. The Republicans have said from the very beginning that there must have been a double agent in that team, and I find it very hard not to agree with that.
Well, then how does that fit into what we've talked about?
Well, maybe the answer to this question lies with that agency of government which apparently can be secret, no matter what it does, the CIA, because that has been, to some extent, the kind of dark character in this whole operation, because all these people, Hunt, Liddy, McCord, Barker, even though they worked years for the CIA, claim the CIA has had nothing to do with this directly. I mean, they have repudiated any link between the CREEP, Nixon's campaign organization, and Nixon's activities, and the CIA, even when they supposedly brought up this whole issue of the intervention to try to blame the whole caper on the CIA. Maybe that's where the factor of the double agent lies.
Well, I think it's a bit early to speculate, but some of the symptoms about the break-in, let's take one, for example. If an ordinary police car had come to respond to that break-in, they wouldn't have been caught because they were watching for the police. But there was some kind of incredible accident. The local police car was being gassed up at that moment, so you send in an unmarked car, which means these sort of special squads, which every police force has, and are the local sort of. There's a very close. They're like local CIAs. They have their own special operations, their own special intelligence, and it was those people who went in, so they weren't observed. Quite a lot of questioning about this fact, and it turns out we learned from the Irvin Committee that these people actually went in after hours. That this unmarked car was supposed to have gone off at midnight, but for some reason. What was the testimony? That there'd been a lot of break-ins around there recently, and they'd found that they scored better on these break-ins sometimes if they put in overtime. So that night they happened to put in some overtime, and they happened to turn up. I don't know that I personally would feel better waiting for a bit more of the evidence to come in, but that there's more to this whole thing than meets the eye, I think almost any observer would concede at this point, wouldn't they? I mean, it isn't just a case of somebody trying to get into a room and then and getting caught at it. I mean, I think that's been more or less sort of understood from the very beginning.
There is a major factional fight, and faction not in the small sense. I mean, probably very broad interests are ultimately involved in this thing, but the kind of factional struggle that's going on, and it is still going on now. On the other hand, I think people should be aware of the fact that at some point the issue may be resolved. That's to say that clearly the country can't stand still, and that at some point the losers will be the real losers, and I think there are real losers in this. I think they're fighting back desperately. I think the old FBI is a loser, fighting back desperately. I think some of the old CIA types are losers. There are lots of losers, and no one's clear yet who the winners are. But at some point, as in all factional struggles, the lines will become clearer, who the losers and who the winners are. And I think that's what people kind of should sort of watch for, because at that point, I would suspect that Watergate might suddenly end or terminate very rapidly, or a few people be sent off to jail.
If I could make another analogy, I think this is the biggest investigation that's been going on in Washington since the Bobby Baker investigation and the TFX General Dynamics investigation in 1963, both of which were coming to a head.
When in fact, the TFX thing ended pretty much when Kennedy was assassinated.
They had a meeting on November 20th, 1963, and the newspapers reported that Fred Korth would be the next witness when the committee reconvened the next week, which would have been November 27th, 1963. I didn't check my dates on this, but I think, in fact, the next TFX committee hearing was in 1967 or something like that, when they had really, and Korth, needless to say, never was called as a witness at all.
Except those were business scandals, and this is much more like a constitutional crisis.
But I think the Bobby Baker hearing, if it had continued in the direction it was starting to go in, would have reached not only into government, but into the same areas of government, and maybe even some of the same personnel. One of the things that we haven't yet heard from the Irvin Committee, which was very prominent in the initial investigations, was the role of the people who paid for all this sort of thing, the role of the banks, the role of where did all those $100 bills come from initially? And thank God for the General Accounting Office, which came in with a very good report which traced these funds through Bernard Barker's bank account, which incidentally was in a bank which is some of the original directors of which are some of the top political manipulators in the country, back to another bank. You can trace interlocks through all of this thing. And that's where I hope that the Irvin Committee will end up with. They've started at the very bottom, with the people who were in that DNC room that particular night. I hope they will go the same route that the GAO did and travel back through the people who collected the funds to the top money man, apparently Maurice Stans, for example. They're supposed to. It's on their list. And finally, think about the role of these people who have paid the money to people like Stans, because I think they are a discernible element in American politics and are well worthy of study. And that's why I was so sorry about the Patman Committee, who I think have the House Committee on Banking and Currency. They have a very good record in this. They had already investigated the bank. They had put, in connection with the collapse of the Penn Central, they had put out a report which actually named the bank, one of the banks which was associated with this purchase of a cashier's check down in Florida, which ended up in Bernard Barker's bank account. The Patman Committee, remember, failed to vote to go ahead with a full investigation, in part at that time because the Watergate case had not yet come to trial, and they said it would prejudice the chances of the defendants. Now the field is being preempted by the Irvin Committee, and I have no reason to doubt yet that the Irvin Committee will do a good job. And I think as everyone who's listening to this broadcast who's interested in things should just keep track and make sure that they cover all of the kind of shady areas which had come out in the initial investigation 6 months ago, because certainly not enough to just diddle around with the conflicting testimonies of McCord and Olch.
I think Franz said it very well before we began to tape this program. He said that at this point we are dealing with a jigsaw puzzle that has 100 pieces. We've only been given 3 pieces so far, and none of our 3 pieces fit together. So let me end by asking you if basically how serious you believe the governmental crisis actually is. Do you think that we will continue to get pieces of this puzzle and come back together over the airwaves of KPFA and continue to put it together? Or do you think that something very serious and very critical could happen that would divert us from putting together this puzzle?
Well, let me say a few things here. I think that there, the recent history of this country, crisis periods have been one where everything is closed up, like decisions to go into Vietnam and decisions to go into Korea and so on. That things happen very rapidly, but also under closed doors. Now, this is one time when a crisis has opened the doors for a very brief period into the labyrinth of government. The normal tendency is for those doors to close again, and those doors will close, in my estimation, once some issue has been decided. But the struggle is so intense now. I think there's a real conflict, a real powerful conflict that we can gain insights. It's like during a surgical operation. For a while you can see how the innards operate, but then it's sewn up again, and then it's harder to do that, unless you open it up again and you don't cut open people, every 24 hours. So my feeling would be that one should, that to utilize these moments when truth comes out, as much as possible, and learn what one can. I mean, the idea that somehow the truth will be presented before the people, or the truth will come out, I think is never happens anywhere under any circumstances. Truth only comes out at crisis periods as it is coming out in this fashion. So that in a way the record of what's already come out is very rich. I think a lot of the testimony has little phrases and innuendos that are useful and must be used, because that's all we're going to get. We're not going to get much more. And we got the Pentagon Papers. Peter and I both have done some work on it, and it's certainly not something you read as the spoken word of God the Father Almighty on what everything is about. So that would be my feeling that this is the case. The other thing, of course, is that the question that I've heard people say is, well, what should the position of the left be on this, or people who are in opposition and so on. Well, I don't see that there's any possible position that one can take, because the wolves are fighting amongst each other, or let's say one tribe of wolves and we're the other tribe. But anyway, they're fighting amongst each other. It's a drama in which the contradictions within the ruling elements have reached explosive and bloody proportions. I think I don't think the struggle is over by far. But in a way, it's a struggle that will affect all of us, but yet that neither the left nor even the liberals, in a way, the center, I mean the old-fashioned center, have a very great part. It's somehow happening within the ruling interests and their representatives in the structures of power.
I'd like to answer your question by distinguishing again between the two kinds of crisis. I think the surface crisis of Watergate might be turned off as dramatically as it was turned on. That could happen. The underlying economic crisis, which I would call a crisis of retrenchment. What happens to a country, an economy which has been expanding since it began, practically, for centuries? Now suddenly has to stabilize itself, and particularly in the overseas area, actually to undergo a certain kind of retrenchment of operations. That is a very real crisis, one which I don't think we've yet really begun to face, one which for the marginal groups I was talking about, the quick buck operators, the people who are trying to get a rich contract out of the Defense Department budget this year, even if it contributes to the bankruptcy of the whole country 5 years from now, those people, far from being damped down by anything happened up to the present, I think they're more active and more dangerous than ever. The kind of operation which is symbolized by IOS and first Bernie Kornfeld and then later Vesco. That kind of quick buck operation represents, I think, a very dangerous force. All the people who've grown fat on the defense budget and don't know what to do when the defense budget is cut back, I think that's a very real crisis and will continue regardless of what happens to Watergate.
Well, our time's just about up. I'd like to thank Peter for being with us, and Fran also, and Franz as well. And this is Marty Gellen from the Bay Area Institute.
This program was distributed by the Pacifica Program Service in Berkeley. All rights are reserved.